Positioning is obviously a really important concept when you're dealing with your web page layout design. If you don't know how to work with positioning, you're not going to get things to be in the position you want them to be. And
Huh?
isn't that what layout is all about? So there are three different types of CSS positioning. And one of them we reviewed in the previous video. I'll cover it again here. But the other two we haven't talked about yet. And I'll cover those in pretty good detail. So the first type of positioning I want to talk about is normal document flow. And again, if you haven't watched the previous video, I recommend you do so. Maybe stop this one, go back and watch that, and then come back here, because that will have concepts in it that will help you understand what we're going to discuss in this video. So normal document flow is just very simply that the browser will automatically apply certain attributes to your elements unless you tell it to do otherwise. And so if you have a box on a page and you do nothing to establish positioning of that box, the browser will take it and it will put it all the way to the left and all the way to the top as far as it will go. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's the basis of what normal document flow does. And the other types of positioning is for when this type of flow isn't getting you the result you want. Now, probably the most common form of positioning, and we've probably used it in class before you were even watching this, is called floating. And very simply what that means is that you can specify in your CSS code that you would like an element to go all the way to the left or all the way to the right. And what's nice about this is it gives you a way of placing your elements in position relative to each other. And in the example we're going to do in just a minute, you'll see that this is a natural way to create things like columns that you can put type in and create layout. Lots of web page layouts are done by floating boxes to create columns. So again, you can tell something to float to the left, you can tell something to float to the right, and that just means it will push it to the extreme in either direction of the parent container. And then the third type of positioning is called absolutely positioned elements. And there are two types of this. There is absolute and there is fixed. Absolute means that it's relative to the container it's inside of, and fixed means it's going to be relative to the browser window. And so it's a really powerful way to position things, because you can say, I want this to be exactly there. But the price you pay for that is you lose some flexibility. But for certain types of layouts you want to do, it really is, if not the best solution, maybe the only solution to get something positioned where you want it to be. And so those are the different types of positioning we're going to be talking about when we get into Dreamweaver. And it'll make a lot more sense when we play around and position some things using these different concepts. All right, so here we are in Dreamweaver, and let me just quickly review what you're looking at here. Basically, we have a background, which is the body, just colored with yellow. We have a box here called section. It's a section element filled with kind of a safety orange. And then we have three other boxes. One is green color, one is a magenta color, and then this down one here, which is kind of a violet color. Now right now these are all just in normal document flow. So if we look over here at the code, you'll see the width of the section element is 750, has a height of 525. It's being centered through how we've defined the margins. It's got some padding on the bottom, and it's got that background color. And then the three boxes are each called a column. So there's column 1, which has a width of 210 and a height of 450. Column 2, same width, height of 300, and column 3, again with the same width, but a height of 150. These also have padding, which we aren't really using now, but in a little bit we are going to put some text into these boxes so you can see how they could work as columns. Now there are some rules here that have been grayed out or commented out. I'll get back to those later. And the same down here with the text. And so we will uncomment that in a bit, and so that the text shows up inside the boxes. But the basic structure of the HTML is quite simple. We've got our section, which everything is inside of, and then inside of the section we have a div ID for column 1, a div ID for column 2, and a div ID for column 3. And so that's it. That's all there is. So we'll make this more complex as we go along, but for now our structure is quite simple. Alright, so right now we're just in normal document flow. These divs are block level elements, so if you don't tell them anything else,
I don't want to know.
They will automatically just stack one on top of the other. And so what we'd like to do is make it so they aren't stacked one on top of the other, and we're going to initially use floating to accomplish this. And so I'm just going to go ahead and add some float attributes to the 3 columns here. So I'm going to start on column 1. And I'm just going to type in float, and you can do this in your CSS designer window. I find this kind of stuff actually quicker to just type it in usually. And I'm going to give the column 1 a float right, which means it will push all the way to the right side of the section element which this box is in. So I will click refresh, and you'll see a couple of things happen. Yes, column 1 pushes all the way over to the right, but something even more significant happened, and that these 2 columns scooted up to the top. And so what's important to note here is that when you use float positioning, it takes it completely out of normal document flow. And what that means is that the document really isn't seeing it anymore. It's existing outside of it. And so these elements, which are still in normal document flow, will behave as if this element didn't exist. And so that's what's occurring here. And so to kind of further emphasize that, let me do just a little bit more. I am going to give column 2 a float left. And let's see what happens here.
What?
Okay, that's kind of bizarre, isn't it?
Yes, sir!
It's like column 3 just disappeared. But the thing is, column 3 did not disappear. It did the same thing that happened when we applied the float to column 1, is that it scooted up. Now that we've also applied a float to column 2, we've taken it out of normal document flow, and therefore column 3 just scoots up to the top left, and because this is a bigger box, we're not seeing the box underneath it. And so to kind of prove that it's still there, let me show you what happens when I give column 3 a float right. So I'm going to cheat this time and just copy and paste.
No way.
And so there it is again. Column 1 and column 3 are both float right, which means they're pushing as far as they can go to the right side of the containing box. And so column 1 is first, so it goes all the way to the edge, and then column 3 is next, and it can only go so far until it runs into column 1. And then column 2 is really just kind of acting independently here. It's just kind of pushing its way all the way to the left. But they're equal width, and they all 250 into 750. I think you get the math. At least I hope you do. So anyway, that's how floating works. So let's just change this to more of a normal situation, like you might use it in a layout. So there's different things you can do. You could make column 1 and 2 be float left, or column 2 and 3 be float right, like you have here. But often what I like to do is just make everything float left. And so I'm going to do that. And what you'll see is that they are now in order. So this is column 1, column 2, column 3. Each one is floating to the left, basically pushing as far left as it can go until something else gets in the way, like the edge of the parent container or another floated object. And so I think you can see at this point how these are really very much like columns. In fact, let's kind of make them be columns and go down and release that text we have in the HTML.
Okay!
So I'm going to pull down to the HTML and just uncomment each of these P elements. And one last one to go. And let's refresh.
Ah!
Now, something's a little funky here, but we can fix this. Basically, the boxes aren't reacting to the type, and I would like it to do so. I would like the box to be the size it needs to be, depending on how long the type runs. And it's not doing that right now because I've given each of these boxes a specific height. And so I just want to remove that and let the content define how tall the box needs to be. So delete the height from each one of these columns. And there we go. Now, what is keeping the type from going all the way to the edges of these boxes? Well, I've given each one of these a padding of 20 pixels to kind of keep it away from the edge, make it more readable, and just give everything a little bit of room to read. And so that's a very basic way that floating works, and a way that you will most likely use it in this class at some time or other. But let me show you another way that you can use floats, which is very handy if you're doing a layout with text and an image. And so I'm going to go down here, and I am going to uncomment this rule right here called pick. So that's defining a div, which will have a margin right of 10 pixels, a margin top of 10 pixels, and it will float to the left. And then down here in the HTML, you'll see a div with an ID of pick. And so what I want to do now is just insert an image into that box and let the type kind of float around it. Okay, this is called HG logo. I spent some time getting this into the exact position I wanted it to be by adjusting these numbers over here. But say I wanted this to be to the right instead of the left, then I could go in and I could change that to float right. And then I could adjust my right margin to be my left margin so that it gave a little space through here. And I could adjust it until the cows came home, until it was just the way I liked. But the way I initially showed it to you is the way I like it best, so I'm just going to undo and get back to that place that makes me so very happy. And so that's kind of where I'm going to stop with floating. Now, with all of these positioning approaches, there's so much more you can learn, way too much for me to cover in this video, and really way too much to cover in the time we have in class. So I'd really recommend that if you find something that you want to do and aren't sure how to do it, definitely check with me and I can help you figure it out. You can also check lynda.com, and you can also check some of the web resources I've shown you in class, such as w3schools.org. But anyway, let's move on now to the next form, which is relative. And relative is actually a form of normal document flow. And the reason it's important is twofold. Is a lot of times when you do a certain type of positioning, you need to have the object that the positioned objects are inside of have a position as well. And so when you give it a position of relative, it's basically just saying this object has positioning, it's just in normal document flow. And then that establishes a relationship that the other objects can relate to. But you can also deviate from normal document flow by giving it some parameters relative to its current position. And so if I go up here to the rule right above pick, you'll see there's another commented rule called relative. So I'm going to uncomment that. And you'll see that it's been given a position of relative. So that's saying normal document flow, just put this element wherever it's supposed to be. But then move it 75 pixels up from its top edge. Okay, so that's interesting. So move it 75 pixels up from where it's supposed to be. And so I've created a little span element down here in the second paragraph. And so if you look right here in the first line of column 2, you'll see there's a little span element right here. And so what I'm going to do is just give that span a class of relative. And I'm going to let Dreamweaver kind of help me type this in. Click refresh, and son of a gun. I don't know if you noticed what happened when I clicked refresh, but these three words right here, which have the span element around them, moved up 75 pixels from where they were. And something else really interesting happened. Remember in float how things kind of moved in to fill the space when we changed the position of an object?
Yeah.
Well, kind of exactly the opposite happened here, is that we were able to isolate those three words and say, this is where you're supposed to be. Now move it 75 pixels up from where you're supposed to be. And then everything else, though, is still in normal document flow, so it doesn't move. It just stays right where it's supposed to be. It really is recognizing it as still being there, even though it's not still there. Okay, so that's relative positioning, so you can kind of see the power of that. I'm going to go ahead and just remove this class so that type goes back into its appropriate position. And now let's look at the type of positioning called absolute. And so absolute and fixed are both very strongly related. They're both ways of absolutely positioning elements within another element or within the browser window itself. So absolute allows you to position things within a containing element to a very specific degree. And so let's go back up into the CSS rules here. And what I'm going to do is remove all of the float lefts on each of the three columns. So I'm going to click refresh now, and I think you know what's going to happen. Yes. That's exactly what we expected to happen. It returned to normal document flow. But I want to put those right back into the same position they were in, but this time using absolute positioning. So I mentioned earlier that one of the primary uses of relative positioning is it establishes a ground for other elements to relate to. And absolute positioning, this is very important. The only way absolute positioning will work if it's inside of a container element that has been positioned as well. So that's what this section element is going to be. It's going to be the container for these absolutely positioned boxes. But we don't really want to put this anywhere else. We just want to establish it as having a position. And so that's a case where we can make the position be relative, which means it's in normal document flow, but we aren't going to give it any other parameters, so it's just going to say exactly where it is. So I'm going to type position here. And then I would like this to be relative. Okay, I'll click refresh. And you see that absolutely nothing changes, which is as it should be. Now for these three columns, these I want to go in and give them a position of absolute. So that's I'm going to go to column 1 here and type position and make this position the absolute. And then I want to give this a top position of 0. And I want to give it a left position, also of 0. And so why those numbers? Well, because this section here is being established as having the position that everything else is related to, when you give it, positions of 0 and 0, it's oriented to the very top left corner. So much like you would look at a graph, it starts in the top left corner, and your x goes down, and your y goes across. And that's how this is. So since I want this box to be stuck right in the upper left-hand corner, I just say go to top and left 0. Okay, so I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this into column 2 here, and position absolute. Top is still going to be 0. It's going to be 0 for all three of these. But the left is going to be different, because it needs to be next to column 1. Each of the columns are 250 pixels wide, so that means the left edge of column 2 will be at 250 pixels. And let's just click refresh and see if it works. So far, so good. All right, we got one more to go. And I, again, am just going to paste, do it the lazy man's way. And this third column is going to be 500 pixels from the left edge. And I could also do right 0 if I wanted. And there we go. So again, these blocks, these columns are positioned exactly the same as they were when we floated them, but we've done it instead by using absolute positioning. Now, I think if you were going to do this layout, floating is the better way to go. The downside of absolute positioning is that you do lose some flexibility because elements don't relate to each other and react to each other in the same way. So floating tends to stay more reactive, which is often better. But you may have a situation where absolute positioning is really the only way to get an element into the position you'd like it to be. So fixed positioning, the last one we want to talk about. Very similar to absolute. In fact, it's pretty easy to mix them up. But the difference here is that fixed means you are relating to what's called the viewport, more simply said, the browser window. And it's telling the browser where to put something relative to that viewport window. And so I'm going to pull down here and uncomment the very last rule. This one is called FE. And you'll see what I've done here is given FE a position of fixed and a position of bottom 0 pixels, right 0 pixels. Okay, so what does that mean?
I don't know.
Well, let's put this in and you'll see what it means. So down here at the very bottom, and what's interesting is it really doesn't matter very much where you put this div. Just as long as it's within the body, that's fine, because it's not being positioned by where it is in the code. It's being positioned by the parameters we've given it. And so I'm going to click here between the open and closing tags for the FE div and just go ahead and put that image in. And there we go. In order to really see the effect of this, we need to preview this in a browser. So just so you know why this looks so good, I'm not seeing all the dotted lines and stuff, it's because I'm working in live view within Dreamweaver, which can be very handy, but ultimately you really need to preview this in a browser. So let's save this and let's take a look. Okay, so like I said, in order to really appreciate how neat this is, we've got to be able to see it in the browser so that we can resize the browser window. So by giving it the position of right 0 and bottom 0, it's saying put this picture, this div, in the very lower right-hand corner of the browser window. And then as you resize this,
oh my God,
you'll see that it stays in exactly that position. And so that's really cool and kind of neat. There is a negative, though, and that is that you can actually start covering up stuff to possibly make it unreadable or unviewable. So you've got to be very careful where you use this type of positioning so that you don't override the functionality of your site. But you've seen this effect, I'm sure, in different websites where maybe they'll have a menu or maybe they'll have an ad or something like that that just always stays in the same position relative to the edges of the browser window. So it can be quite effective. You just got to be careful how you use it. I'm going to stop right here.
thank God.
As I mentioned in the beginning, this should give you a good understanding of the different types of positioning, but you can do so much more with these, and there's so many little variables you can play with. So as you need it, you can do your research and find out how to do what you need to do, but in the meantime, this should get you started.
Yeah,